everyone on the electoral roll must vote and instructed to write yes or no to the question, to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve of this proposed alteration?
We will shortly be all required to vote in a referendum, which I believe is based on a flawed assumption that recognising Indigenous people requires fundamental changes to our Constitution. This is not true. Voting against the voice does not mean that you are against acknowledging Indigenous people. I myself am in favour of acknowledging Indigenous people. But there is another and better way to recognise Indigenous people. Instead of creating a whole new chapter in the Constitution, which would undoubtedly lead to High Court challenges, to stalled, gummed-up parliamentary processes, and an undermining of our representative democracy, I believe Indigenous people should be acknowledged in the preamble of the Constitution in an appropriate way. Done properly, Indigenous people can be recognised for their unique status as inhabitants prior to European settlement of this ancient land. They can be honoured in a way that brings all Australians together rather than divides. Supporters of the voice say it will close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
Because the gap isn't closing fast enough.
But the voice would likely do very little to close the gap. It may make it worse, because it sadly appears to be just another project in a long line of failed attempts, often aiming at the wrong issues, often addressing issues in less than optimal ways. One example of this kind of distraction is the persistent focus on native title, as though it can genuinely affect outcomes for disadvantaged Australians. It may surprise you to know that native title claims cover at least 43% of Australia's landmass and 143,000 square kilometres of ocean. I repeat, getting on for 1/2 of Australia is listed under native title. Now, this does enable Indigenous people to carry out important cultural practices on traditional land, but what it hasn't done and isn't doing is improving their socio-economic conditions, their health outcomes or opportunities. Indeed, it's estimated that 80% of Indigenous Australians live functional lives. Many of the remaining 20% are in tragic circumstances. There can be no doubt about the need to act on those. It's a question of how we do it. And to help address the everyday issues facing this group of struggling Aboriginal people, what is really needed is focus on the primary causes of disadvantage and marginalisation. One such cause that is close to my heart is the issue of fatherlessness and community dysfunctionality in general. But fatherlessness in particular creates broken and dysfunctional families where kids suffer the most. Beyond well-known examples of this brokenness, like welfare dependency and alcoholism, is the issue of education. Only 14% of children in remote Northern Territory communities regularly attend school. We don't need a constitutionally enshrined initiative from the same stable of failed attempts that have left us where we are today. But recognising Indigenous people in the preamble is no panacea either. What we really need, more than a preamble, and certainly more than a troublesome voice, is courage to address the true causes of Indigenous disadvantage with honesty. It might mean some humility as well, in our willingness to listen and in the setting of our expectations. We need to understand what lawmakers and regulators can do and what they can't do. Because for this portion of disadvantaged Australians, the difficulties run deep. And to see real gains, they'll need generations of sustained community-driven effort, not just government-imposed responses. In addition to a raft of other concerns, I believe the referendum and the proposed voice it represents is a distraction from the real problems facing these communities. I urge you to recognise a better way for us Aboriginal Australians, and that begins by voting no on this model for a so-called voice to Parliament.